Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is my mid-August wrap-up. A little later than it would usually be, but I was on a 2,500 kilometer road trip from South Texas up to my mother's house in southern Ontario, where I am now. I'm looking after some family things, so it's been harder for me to get online often, but here I am. Let's talk about some books. So the first thing I was reading was an audiobook that I was listening to on the drive up here, which just happened to be something that my husband had on his phone, which was The Woman in Cabin 10. I was not a huge fan of it, to be honest. It wouldn't have been something that I would have picked on my own. It was interesting enough, but the main character was super... I don't even know if unlikable is the right word, but she made a lot of poor decisions, and even when she was aware of her poor decisions, she kept making poor decisions. She seemed super unprofessional. We're supposed to believe that she's like trying to get her career up. In any case, there was about 45 minutes left on the recording at the point where my husband was flying home and I was still driving on, and at some point I suppose I could read the last 2 chapters of that book to see what happens, but at this point I'm not super enthusiastic to do that because I wasn't that interested to see how it turned out. But we'll see. I might check that out at some point. So around that same time when we were doing the drives, there were a lot of videos coming out about diversity and building up Diversithon, and because I was on the road I wasn't part of any of the conversations, but I saw the recommendation list that was going on, and so I put on a favorite book of mine on that list, which is The Quiet Violence of Dreams by Sello Duiker, and I didn't have a copy of this on hand at the time because I lent this to a friend of mine 4 years ago and she never gave it back, and about a year ago I thought I'm gonna rebuy this, and I realized it wasn't in print anywhere in North America, and the shop that I used to buy books from South Africa and have them shipped over in an affordable way had gone out of business. So I went on Books Depository and told them to notify me when they had copies of it in stock again, and that happened to happen at the same time that I was putting this book on that recommendation list. So I got it, I had it shipped to my mother's house since I knew I was going there, and it came, and I reread this because I meant to reread maybe a couple of my favorite parts, and 5 hours later it was 3 a.m. and I had reread the whole book because I just love this. And there's so many levels that you could recommend this about, because even if I described it as a story of the main character and his journey towards his understanding of the world, it's hard to describe, but it's worth reading on so many levels, and especially if you haven't read much about South Africa outside of maybe some Nadine Gordimer or some J.M. Coetzee or something, and if that's all you've read, maybe check something like this out because it's a different angle. And yeah, this is fantastic. I've always thought it was, I mean, it's always sad when someone commits suicide, but when this author killed himself 11 years ago, it was just such a loss because he was so brilliant. He only had 3 books that came out, but they're all worth picking up. This one I think is really fantastic. So the next thing I read was Vincent Lambs' Bloodletting and Miraculous Cures. It's a set of short stories about these 4 doctors and their interwoven lives throughout the years. They start as self-described med school keeners, and then they move on and develop their careers and everything. It apparently won the Giller Prize, which is funny because it doesn't read like literary fiction, and I feel like if this was sold as a novel and had a slightly more linear timeline, as opposed to being short stories with the time gaps, that this would just be contemporary fiction from the early 2000s. I mean, people have Palm Pilots, there's talk about SARS, stuff like that. But because it was written that way, it was, I don't know, somehow sold as literary fiction. That's not a criticism of the book so much as it's, I was reading it and I was expecting something less trashy. Sounds mean, but that's kind of what it was. It felt very gossipy. I think it's funny, I feel like if somebody was reading this for, say, Diversithon, they'd make a big deal and say, well, the author is a Canadian emergency room doctor whose parents are Chinese from Vietnam, and so is he. But what I was really thinking is there's a character in here who's, maybe loosely based on him, and you were thinking, wow, was his grandfather really a gambler? Is his wife's ex really an alcoholic? And, see, that was more the takeaway. So I did think it was funny that it won this literary prize because it doesn't really read like literary fiction. But, that's not really a pro or con, it was still fun. Next up was some more short stories. This is M.G. Vassanji's Uhuru Street, which is, again, interlinked short stories. about a specific neighborhood in Dar es Salaam, and it's just about, you know, people in the neighborhood and what they're doing and where they came from and where they're going, because most of them are of South Asian ancestry, although they've been like 3 generations in Tanzania, and a lot of them are eventually moving to Canada at some point. But yeah, it's similar ground to the book that I was talking about last month, the name of which is escaping me now. Yeah, I mean, it was good. It's short. I was, yeah, if I was talking about those short stories as being a little trashy, this is really trashy. This is Chase Your Shadow, The Trials of Oscar Pistorius. I only bought this because it was $2 on Book Outlet. And honestly, I was reading it on the subway and I took the cover off because I was embarrassed to be seen reading this in public. It's, you know, the author is biased and he's upfront about that, which surprised me a little. I thought he was going to be more of the journalist and be presenting multiple sides of the story, and he wasn't. He's very much, oh, it was an accident. I mean, it's celebrity true crime, so you're not going to take that too seriously. And, you know, it's not meant to be a great work of literature, so knowing that this was going to be trashy, you know, I got the $2 that I paid for this. And so then I read another piece of nonfiction, a non-trashy one this time, which is Emily Urquhart's Beyond the Pale. So Emily Urquhart is the daughter of Jane Urquhart, and she has that same kind of lyrical writing style that her mother has. Is that genetic? Who knows? But what is genetic is albinism, which her daughter has, and this is the book that she wrote after her daughter was diagnosed, and she went and researched the folklore around albinism, and also what folk beliefs mean for people, especially in Tanzania, where they end up facing a lot of violence and discrimination because of that stem from folk beliefs. And then also, because of the genetic aspect, she's researching her own family history for other people with albinism, which is, again, interesting to read. This was really well written, but I felt like it was a little bit overhyped because everything I'd heard presented this as this really fantastic, new and different kind of book. And while the folklore take was different than a lot of the, I think, books that you read about parents who have a child that's diagnosed with something and then they go and figure out more about it. So it was a different angle, but the overall tone wasn't super different from that. And there were some discussions around language. There's one early on where she talks about people in the know say this. And it gave me pause because there's so much discussion about language of, you know, identity language versus person first language and people reclaiming slurs and things like that you usually see in a lot of discussions of disability that are not written by parents. And so because she led with that in one of the really early chapters, and then it wasn't addressed again until much later on, she's at a conference and one of the speakers makes a comment about, you know, some of you may have reclaimed this word, be aware that some people will be hurt by that, so watch your language. And having that later, you kind of get why she presented the language piece the way she presented it early on. But knowing how common that discussion is in other communities, it did give me pause for that first bit of the book before we hit that second conversation. I don't want to say it sounded like she was speaking over people, but it made me raise an eyebrow and say, well, I've not known a lot of people with albinism, but of the 2 that I've known, they both use both terms, and I felt like, you know, by saying people in the know only use one, you kind of go, well, I don't know how true that is, and I know how that plays out in other communities, and it made me wonder about that. And I don't think that was intended, because that's clearly she's taking you on this fairy tale where she's, you know, learning about her history and the history in general, and that's all great. And I just found that one line really distracting for this, you know, one segment of the book, which maybe it's just me and maybe I was overthinking it. So, and it may be, so that's a minor complaint, because I still really enjoyed this. It just sort of threw me off because I wasn't expecting that early on, and I wasn't expecting it to not have discussion when there's so much other discussion of language and culture and everything. But yeah, neat. That's not really a criticism. This was worth the reading. And then the next thing I read were some kids' books, which are the newest American Girl stories, which are about their new character Melody, who is a girl from the 1960s, and they're about the civil rights movement and also about Motown music. And they're set in Detroit, and they were really cute. And I know some people aren't fans of American Girl as a company. They think it's too corporate, but, or, you know, they were fans of it in the past, but they don't like the way, the direction the company's gone. But I think they still do a really good job of introducing kids, and specifically girls, in that, you know, 8 to 12-year-old age range, to fairly serious historical topics in a way that's, you know, not light in an inappropriate way, but light enough and makes history fun. And yeah, I mean, I think these did a great job of it. I thought a couple of years ago when I was living in Washington, D.C., I remember there was a civil rights exhibit in the American History Museum, which is not there anymore, although I think there's going to be something similar in the museum that's opening this weekend, I think, in D.C., the African American History Museum, which is also a Smithsonian museum. Anyway, I remember seeing that and thinking, if you had a kid who was 15 or older, you might want to give them the John Lewis graphic novel memoirs, March, as a tie-in for that. And in the same way, if you had a slightly younger kid, you can give them these, and it's a similar background in a way that's friendly for that age group. So, yeah, these were really nicely done, I thought. And finally, just last night, I finished Thieves Corey by D.B. Jackson, which is a series that I talked about last month when I read the first one, Thief Taker. It is urban fantasy set in 1760s Boston, and the main character is a detective slash magician, and it's fun. It's a, you know, crime slash fantasy series, and they're entertaining. There are a few too many twists maybe, but they're fun to read, and I'm enjoying the series. It's always hard with the second one. In one of these, the author settles into a routine, and they're not necessarily new and exciting in the way the first one was, but this was a good read. It was fun. And there you go.